The fluorescent lights of the emergency room hummed a relentless, indifferent tune, a soundtrack to the controlled chaos that was Naomi's life. At 22, she moved with a weary grace that belied her years, her dark green scrubs a second skin. She was good at her job. Quick, compassionate, and precise, but the constant pressure was a physical weight, made heavier by the acidic presence of Dr. Alistair Finch. He was a senior attending physician with a reputation that curdled the air, a man who wielded his authority like a scalpel, not for healing, but for inflicting small, deep wounds on those he deemed beneath him. Tonight, the ER was a symphony of beeps, hurried footsteps, and pained groans. A multi-car pileup had flooded the bays, and Naomi was trying to stabilize a patient's blood pressure while simultaneously fielding questions from a frantic family member. She felt Finch's shadow fall over her before she saw him. "Nurse," his voice was a low growl, laced with impatience. "Did you not hear me? I asked for the atropine 5 minutes ago. Are you deaf as well as incompetent?" Naomi didn't look up, her focus locked on the monitor. "It's on your tray, doctor." "I placed it there myself." A tense silence followed, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor. She felt a sharp, searing pain at her scalp. Her head was yanked back, forcing her to look up from her patient. Finch had a fistful of her tightly coiled hair, his knuckles white, his face a mask of crimson fury. "When I speak to you," he hissed, his breath sour with coffee, "you look at me." Gasps rippled through the nearby staff. No one moved. Fear of Finch was a paralytic, a venom that had long since infected the department. Tears of humiliation and pain pricked Naomi's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She met his cold, blue gaze with a silent fire of her own. It was in that frozen, terrible moment that the automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. The ambient chaos of the ER seemed to dim, the sound sucked into a vacuum created by the men who entered. They were dressed in immaculate dark suits that seemed to absorb the harsh lighting, moving with a fluid, predatory calm that was utterly alien to the hospital's frantic energy. At their center was a man whose stillness was more commanding than any shout. He was Korean, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, his features carved with a severe elegance. His presence was a low hum of power, a quiet storm that made the air feel thick and heavy. He stopped just inside the entrance, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the scene with an unnerving placidity. His eyes, dark and unreadable, finally settled on Dr. Finch and the nurse whose hair he held like a leash. The man's expression didn't change, yet a palpable chill descended upon the bay. Dr. Finch, blinded by his own rage, seemed to be the last to notice. "Are we clear?" he snarled at Naomi. Before she could answer, a low, resonant voice cut through the tension. "Let her go." The words were spoken in perfect, unaccented English, soft but carrying the weight of absolute command. Finch flinched as if struck, his head whipping around. He finally saw the man standing there, flanked by 2 others who looked as if they were carved from granite. Finch's arrogance was a brittle thing, and it began to crack. He released Naomi's hair abruptly, and she stumbled forward, catching herself on the patient's gurney. She raised a trembling hand to her scalp, her entire body shaking with a mixture of relief and a new, unfamiliar dread. The man in the suit took a slow, deliberate step forward. He wasn't armed, not visibly, but he didn't need to be. His authority was an aura, an undeniable force. "I believe," he said, his voice still quiet, "that a doctor's hands are meant for healing. Not for this." His gaze flickered to Naomi for a fraction of a second, a brief, assessing glance, before returning to the paling doctor. Finch puffed out his chest, a pathetic attempt to reclaim his dominance. "This is a private staff matter. I am the senior physician here, and you are interfering in my emergency room." The man smiled, a thin, cold curve of his lips that held no warmth. "Your emergency room? A temporary distinction. Everything is temporary." He gestured subtly with his hand, and one of his companions produced a pristine, folded handkerchief. He didn't offer it to Finch. He walked past the sputtering doctor, his expensive shoes making no sound on the linoleum, and stopped directly in front of Naomi. He held out the handkerchief. "Are you injured?" he asked, his voice now stripped of its earlier chill, holding a neutral, almost gentle tone. Naomi stared at the fine linen, then up at his face. Up close, she could see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the disciplined set of his jaw. He was waiting, his dark eyes patient. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. "No," she finally whispered, the word barely audible. He nodded once, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than was necessary, an unnerving intensity in his look. Then he turned back to Dr. Finch, who was now sweating profusely. "My associate requires medical attention," the man said, his tone shifting back to ice. "A minor laceration. But we require a different doctor." Someone with better control. He looked past Finch, his eyes scanning the other petrified physicians. "You," he said, pointing to a young resident. "You will attend to him." The resident scurried forward, eager to obey. The powerful man then looked back at Finch, his cold smile returning. "As for you," he said softly, "we will have a conversation later. About professional conduct. And consequences." He then turned his full attention back to Naomi. "Your shift is over. Come." It wasn't a question or a command, but a statement of fact, an opening of a door she never knew existed. Shaking, overwhelmed, and inexplicably feeling a flicker of safety for the first time in years, she looked from the monster who had tormented her to the stranger who had silenced him. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Without a backward glance at the ruins of her career in that hospital, she followed him out of the emergency room and into the cool, dark night. The world she left behind was loud and bright. The one she entered was quiet, shadowed, and defined by the silent, imposing man walking just ahead of her. His name, she would learn, was Jin-Woo Kwon. And he was not a savior. He was something far more complex and far more dangerous. The sleek black car that waited at the curb was an island of silence in the city's nocturnal hum. The door was open for her, and she slid onto the cool leather, the scent of which was rich and clean. Jin-Woo got in beside her, the space suddenly feeling both vast and intensely intimate. The driver pulled away from the curb with impossible smoothness, the hospital shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was just another cluster of lights. Naomi stared out the window, her reflection a pale, wide-eyed ghost against the passing cityscape. Her scalp still throbbed, a dull ache that was a constant reminder of the humiliation. "He will not bother you again," Jin-Woo said, his voice breaking the silence. It wasn't a promise of comfort, it was a declaration of fact. Naomi turned to look at him. In the dim glow of the dashboard lights, his profile was sharp, severe. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. He considered her for a moment, his head tilted slightly. "I am a man who dislikes bullies." It was an evasion, but a telling one. "What do you want from me?" she pressed, a thread of her old defiance returning. She had survived Finch's tyranny. She would not simply trade one cage for another, no matter how gilded. "For now," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "I want to ensure you are safe. The world is full of men like Dr. Finch. Power in their hands becomes a weapon against those who have none. I am offering you a sanctuary, a place to breathe." The car wound its way through the city, climbing into the hills where the buildings gave way to sprawling, private estates hidden behind high walls. It stopped before a set of imposing iron gates, which swung open without a sound. They drove up a long, winding driveway to a house that was less a home and more a modernist fortress of glass, steel, and stone, overlooking the glittering expanse of the city below. Inside, the space was vast and minimalist, furnished with an impeccable, impersonal taste. A middle-aged woman with a kind face and silver-streaked hair met them at the door. "Mrs. Park will show you to your room," Jin-Woo said to Naomi. "Rest. We will speak in the morning." He didn't wait for a reply, simply turned and disappeared down a long hallway, leaving Naomi standing in the echoing silence of the grand foyer. The room she was given was larger than her entire apartment, with a wall of glass that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city lights. There were clean clothes laid out on the bed, and a bathroom stocked with everything she could possibly need. It was a place of impossible luxury, but it felt sterile, empty. That night, sleep offered no escape. She dreamt of Finch's face, his sneering lips, the sickening pull at her roots. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the sheets tangled around her legs. She sat up, breathing heavily, and saw a figure standing in the shadows by the door. Her breath caught in her throat, but then the figure stepped into the sliver of moonlight filtering through the window. It was Jin-woo. He was holding a glass of water. "A nightmare," he stated quietly. He walked over and placed the glass on the bedside table, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I heard you cry out." He made no move to get closer, respecting the boundary of the bed, the invisible line of her fear. "He can't reach you here," Jin-woo said, his voice a low murmur in the quiet room. "I told you that you were safe." That was not a lie. Naomi pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "Safety feels foreign," she admitted, her voice thick with sleep and residual terror. "It will become familiar," he replied. He stood there for a long moment, a silent guardian in the dark, his presence a strange and unexpected comfort. He was a man of shadows and immense unspoken power, yet in that moment, he was simply a shield. He didn't touch her, offered no empty platitudes. He just stayed, a steady presence in the dark, until her breathing evened out and the tremors subsided. That simple act of quiet vigilance did more to soothe her than any words could have. It was the first brick in a foundation of trust she never thought she'd build again. Days bled into weeks. Naomi lived in a state of quiet suspension. Jin-woo was a constant, yet distant, presence. He provided everything: food, clothing, security, but demanded nothing. He left her to her own devices, allowing her the space to heal. She spent her time reading, walking through the meticulously kept gardens, and watching the city from her glass-walled room. They fell into a routine of quiet dinners. The conversations were sparse at first, focused on simple things. But gradually, Naomi found her voice again. She told him about her dream of being a doctor, a dream that Finch's abuse had nearly extinguished. "I wanted to heal people," she confessed one evening, staring into her teacup. "Not just their bodies, but their spirits. That's what a nurse does." But he made it feel dirty. "He made me feel small." Jin-woo listened, his expression unreadable, but his attention was absolute. "He did not make you small," he said after a long silence. "He only revealed his own lack of stature. A person's worth is not determined by the opinion of a lesser man." His words were simple, yet they landed with profound weight. He never complimented her or offered empty praise. He stated facts, observations that chipped away at the insecurities Finch had so carefully built within her. One afternoon, he found her in the library, a vast, two-story room filled with books from floor to ceiling. She was tracing the spine of a medical textbook, a look of deep longing on her face. "You miss it," he observed. "I miss the reason I started," she corrected softly. "Not the place." He walked over to a small, ornate box on a nearby table and opened it. Inside was a single, pristine white coat, folded perfectly. It wasn't a doctor's coat, but a different kind, with a small, discreet insignia on the pocket. "I fund a private clinic," he said, his back still to her. "It serves a community that is often overlooked. They require a skilled nurse. One with compassion." He turned, his dark eyes holding hers. "The position is open if you want it. There would be no one like Dr. Finch there." "I can guarantee it." The offer hung in the air between them, a lifeline she hadn't dared to hope for. It was more than a job. It was a restoration of her purpose, her identity. She saw then that his protection wasn't about caging her. It was about giving her the freedom to fly again. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it. It was gratitude, mingled with a burgeoning, hesitant affection for this complicated, dangerous man. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I would like that very much." The clinic was a revelation. It was clean, well-funded, and served a community of immigrants and elderly who often fell through the cracks of the public healthcare system. Here, Naomi's skills were not just valued, they were celebrated. She worked alongside a small, dedicated team who treated her with immediate respect, a respect she soon realized stemmed from their deep loyalty to their silent benefactor, Jinwoo Kwon. He never visited the clinic while she was working, as if understanding her need to have that space be her own. But she felt his influence everywhere, in the state-of-the-art equipment, the fully stocked pharmacy, and the quiet dignity afforded to every patient. Her confidence returned, stronger than before. The weariness in her eyes was replaced by a bright, focused energy. She was no longer just a victim. She was a healer again. Her relationship with Jinwoo deepened in the quiet hours of the evening, back at the glass house on the hill. The unspoken tension between them grew, a delicate, charged thing. It was in the way his eyes would linger on her when she spoke passionately about a patient, or the way she found herself noticing the rare moments when a genuine, small smile touched his lips. One night, a fierce thunderstorm rolled in from the coast, rattling the great glass walls of the house. The power flickered and died, plunging them into a sudden, deep darkness, broken only by brilliant flashes of lightning. Naomi jolted, a primal fear of the violent noise and sudden dark seizing her. A crash of thunder directly overhead made her gasp, and in the next flash of lightning, she saw Jinwoo was already there, standing a few feet away. He hadn't made a sound. "It is only a storm," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. He didn't move closer, but his presence filled the space, a shield against the tumult outside. "I know," she whispered, her heart still hammering against her ribs. "I've never liked them." Another flash of lightning illuminated his face. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the vulnerability she rarely showed. In that split second, his carefully controlled expression softened. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he was standing before her. He slowly raised his hand, not to touch her face, but to gently push a stray curl from her cheek. His fingers brushed her skin, a touch so light it was barely there, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through her that had nothing to do with the storm. The contact was brief, but it lingered, a warm imprint on her skin. The air between them crackled with an intensity that rivaled the storm. They stood in the dark, caught in a shared silence, the world outside raging while their own private storm built within the confines of the room. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Words were inadequate for what was passing between them. It was an acknowledgement of a connection that had grown in the quiet spaces, in shared meals and silent understanding. When the lights flickered back on a moment later, he had already lowered his hand, his mask of control slipping back into place. But something had irrevocably shifted. The line between protector and protected had blurred, replaced by the delicate, thrilling wire of attraction. The weeks that followed were filled with a palpable, unspoken energy. The memory of his touch in the dark lingered between them, a constant, silent hum. He began to open up in small, incremental ways. He told her about his childhood in Seoul, about the discipline and solitude that had shaped him. He never spoke of the nature of his business, and she never asked. The details didn't seem to matter as much as the man himself, the quiet integrity she saw, the fierce loyalty he inspired, the gentle respect he always showed her. One clear, cold evening, he led her to the highest balcony of the house. The entire city glittered below them, a sprawling tapestry of light and life. They stood side by side at the railing, not speaking, simply sharing the view. "When I was a boy," he said suddenly, his voice low, "I used to look at the city from a tiny, cramped apartment, and I promised myself that one day I would be on top of it, not buried within it." Naomi looked at his profile, at the hard lines of his face softened by the city's glow. "And are you," she asked softly, "on top of it?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "I have power. I have wealth. But it is a cold, solitary view from up here." His eyes searched hers, and she saw a flicker of something she had never seen before in him, a profound loneliness. "It is less so, now that you are here," her breath hitched. The confession, so simple and direct, struck her with more force than any flowery declaration. She saw past the feared Mafia boss, past the powerful benefactor, and saw the man. A man who had built a fortress around himself, not just of steel and glass, but of control and silence. And somehow, she had been allowed inside. Jinwoo, she whispered his name, the first time she had used it without a formal title. He moved closer, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He raised a hand, cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek with an aching tenderness. His gaze dropped to her lips, a clear, unspoken question in his eyes. He was waiting, giving her the choice, the power. In his world, so much was taken without asking. But with her, he asked for everything. Naomi gave him her answer by leaning into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. That was all the permission he needed. He closed the remaining distance, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not demanding or passionate in a fiery way. It was soft, searching, and deeply reverent. It was a kiss that spoke of gratitude, of relief, of finding an anchor in a turbulent sea. It was the taste of safety, the feel of trust, and the promise of a shared future. It was an emotional breakthrough, a sealing of the unspoken bond that had grown between them. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. "Naomi," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. In that single word, she heard everything. The end of his solitude, and the beginning of their shared life. The kiss changed everything. The quiet tension was replaced by a soft, easy intimacy. They held hands while walking in the gardens. He would place a gentle hand on the small of her back as they entered a room. Small, possessive gestures that were not about ownership, but about connection and pride. He seemed to take a quiet pleasure in these simple acts of affection, as if they were a language he was only just learning to speak. One evening, he took her not to a fancy restaurant, but to a small, unassuming noodle shop tucked away in the city's Koreatown. The elderly woman who ran it greeted him with a warm, familial embrace, chiding him in rapid Korean for not visiting sooner. He introduced Naomi simply as someone very important to me. They sat in a small booth, and he ordered for them, telling her stories about coming there as a young man when he had nothing. It was the most vulnerable he had ever been, sharing a piece of his past, of the man he was before he became Jinwoo Kwon. After dinner, he drove them to a nondescript office building downtown. "There is one last thing you need to see," he said, his tone serious. He led her to an empty office on a high floor. The only thing inside was a chair and a large screen on the wall. He pressed a button, and the screen flickered to life, showing a live feed of a desolate, run-down apartment. In it, Dr. Alistair Finch was sitting on a stained mattress, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. He was surrounded by squalor. "He is not dead," Jinwoo said, his voice cold and flat. "Death would have been a mercy, and he deserves none. I took everything from him. His license, his reputation, his money. Every friend he had, every connection, all gone. He cannot practice medicine. He cannot harm anyone ever again. He will live out his days in obscurity and misery, remembering exactly what he lost and why." Naomi watched the screen, not with pity for Finch, but with a sense of finality. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. It was about ensuring the world was safer. She turned to Jinwoo, seeing the cold ruthlessness he was capable of, and she was not afraid. She understood that this power, this darkness in him, was the very thing he used to protect what he cared about. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked down at their joined hands, a flicker of surprise in his eyes, as if he had expected her to recoil. "You are not scared of what I am?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I am not scared of you," she replied firmly, meeting his gaze. "I know who you are." In that moment, their bond solidified into something unbreakable. It was a partnership forged not just in affection, but in a mutual understanding of the world's darkness and the light they could create together within it. They were equals, each with their own strength. He had his power, and she had her compassion. Together, they were whole. A few months later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, they were sitting in the library, a comfortable silence between them as she read a medical journal, and he reviewed some documents. He put his papers down and watched her for a long time, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "Naomi," he said, and she looked up. He got up from his chair and came to kneel before her, taking her free hand in both of his. Her heart began to beat a little faster. "I have spent my life building an empire of solitude," he began, his voice low and steady. "It was safe. It was controlled. And it was empty. You have filled the silence. You have brought warmth to the cold spaces. I do not want to be your protector anymore," he paused, taking a breath. "I want to be your partner. Your husband." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a simple, elegant diamond ring, its brilliance a stark contrast to his dark, dangerous world. It shone like a captured star. "This is not a chain," he said, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "It is a promise. A promise of equality, of a shared future. A promise that you will never be alone, and that I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of your light. Will you marry me, Naomi?" Tears welled in her eyes, tears of joy and profound, overwhelming love. She saw her entire future in his dark, devoted eyes. A future of safety, purpose, and a love that was deeper and more real than anything she had ever imagined. "Yes," she breathed, a radiant smile breaking across her face. "Yes, Jinwoo. I will." The wedding was not a grand affair. It was held in the garden of their home, at twilight, with only Mrs. Park and a few of Jinwoo's most trusted men as witnesses. Naomi wore a simple, elegant white dress, and Jinwoo wore a perfectly tailored dark suit. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promises of unwavering support, mutual respect, and a lifetime of shared sunrises. As he slid the wedding band onto her finger, next to the brilliant diamond, Jinwoo looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, quiet passion that was reserved only for her. "My wife," he said, the words full of wonder and possession, a declaration to the world, and a whisper meant only for her heart. She smiled, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her palm. "My husband," she replied, her voice ringing with a confidence and joy that had been born from the ashes of her old life. Later that night, they stood on the balcony where he had first kissed her, looking out at the glittering city that was now theirs to share. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his strength, feeling utterly safe, utterly cherished. The frightened nurse from the ER was gone, replaced by a strong, resilient woman who had found her power. The feared, solitary Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a devoted husband who had found his heart. The lights of the city seemed to shine brighter than ever before, reflecting the brilliant, unshakable future they had built together, a testament to a love that had bloomed in the most unlikely of shadows, proving that even in the dark, light could not only survive, but flourish.